Water cannot shatter a boulder through violent force, but rather through the endless, quiet persistence of time. The human heart operates much the same way. When everything you have built is utterly destroyed, it does not mean your story is over, but rather that true rebirth is just beginning. The divorce settlement lay cold and heavy on the polished oak desk. It was a grand desk, sitting in the center of a sprawling study that smelled of expensive leather, imported cigars, and aged bourbon. This room was the crown jewel of a magnificent estate, a towering mansion valued at $4.5 million, sitting on 12 acres of pristine, manicured lawns. Elnora Vance stood on the opposite side of the desk, her posture as straight and unyielding as a solitary pine bracing against a bitter winter wind. She was exactly 72 years old. Her face bore the deep, weathered lines of half a century of relentless labor, and her hands were rough, deeply calloused from decades of quiet, uncomplaining sacrifice. 50 years. That was exactly how long she had stood quietly in the shadows, holding the heavy foundation of their lives together, while her husband built his towering business empire from nothing. Elnora remembered the very early days of their marriage with a sharp, stinging clarity. They had possessed nothing but a rusted pickup truck and a shared dream of survival. She remembered waking up at 3 in the morning to bake hundreds of pies to sell at the local farmer's market, remembered walking 3 miles in the freezing snow to deliver them, her breath pluming in the harsh winter air. She remembered scrubbing floors on her hands and knees until her joints burned, remembered saving every single dime in a tin jar hidden beneath their sagging mattress. She had given him her youth. Arthur Vance sat across from her now, a man of 75 who wore his immense wealth like a heavy, suffocating coat. He looked at her with eyes that held no warmth, no gratitude, no memory of their shared struggle. He possessed only the cold, calculating gaze of a man discarding a broken, outdated tool. Beside him stood Cecilia. She was 35 years old, possessing the polished, artificial beauty of a delicate porcelain doll. Cecilia wore a flowing silk dress that cost more than Elnora had spent on herself in 10 long years. She clung tightly to Arthur's arm, casting sideways glances at Elnora with thinly veiled disgust. The contrast between the two women was brutal. Arthur cleared his throat, pushing the thick stack of legal documents 2 inches across the polished wood. "Sign the papers, Elnora," he demanded, with a hollow, authoritative tone that echoed off the high ceiling. "You know it is over. The board of directors wants a younger, more vibrant image for the company, and frankly, so do I. I am keeping the estate, the primary accounts, and the company's shares. I have already moved the liquid assets to a private trust. It is my name on the building, after all." Elnora did not scream. She did not cry, nor did she throw herself at his feet to beg for the meager scraps of the grand life she had single-handedly helped him build. She simply looked at him, her complete silence acting as a heavy, impenetrable shield against his cruelty. Arthur shifted uncomfortably under her steady, piercing gaze, his practiced arrogance faltering for a fraction of a second before he reached quickly into his tailored breast pocket. "I am not leaving you with absolutely nothing," Arthur sneered, tossing a fragile, yellowed piece of paper on the desk, watching it flutter down like a dead leaf. Elnora looked down at the crumbling document. It was the property deed to a tiny plot in Blackwood County, Kentucky, a forgotten place called Whispering Creek Mill. Elnora knew of it from old stories. It was a collapsed, rotting watermill situated in the damp, unforgiving backwoods. It had been completely abandoned since the 1860s, its wooden bones slowly being devoured by decades of heavy rain and total neglect.
The structure was a ruin of splintered oak, rusted iron, and collapsed beams, sitting on a forgotten, isolated 2-acre patch of mud miles from civilization. On the official legal assessment attached to the back of the deed, the property value was listed at exactly $15. It was not a gift, it was a deliberate, calculated humiliation, a cruel joke designed to write off a worthless, rotting asset to evade property taxes while simultaneously insulting the woman who had given him everything. Cecilia let out a soft, mocking laugh, her perfectly manicured fingers covering her mouth to hide her amusement. "It's a lovely little quiet spot for your retirement," Cecilia whispered, her sweet voice dripping with toxic venom. Elnora picked up the heavy brass pen. Her calloused hands did not shake. She pressed the black ink to the paper and signed her name with deliberate, measured strokes, permanently relinquishing her hard-earned claim to the $4.5 million mansion, the luxury cars, and the offshore bank accounts overflowing with millions. She signed away 50 years of her life in complete, absolute silence. When she was finished, she placed the pen down, turned around, and walked out of the study without uttering a single word. She walked slowly upstairs to her modest bedroom, opened a battered leather suitcase she had owned since 1970, and carefully packed 3 faded cotton dresses, 2 pairs of practical leather work boots, and a heavy wool coat. She did not take the diamond jewelry Arthur had given her for their anniversaries, nor did she take the fine silk scarves from the closet. She closed the suitcase, walked out the grand front doors, and stepped into the cold afternoon air. The afternoon sun cast long, dark shadows across the immaculate driveway as she loaded her suitcase into the back of her rusted 1998 station wagon. She turned the key in the engine. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared into life, a rough, mechanical sound that violently broke the unnatural quiet of the wealthy neighborhood. She drove down the quarter-mile of winding asphalt road, leaving the towering iron gates of the estate behind her forever. Arthur stood safely behind the thick glass of his study window, watching her taillights disappear down the hill. A smug, triumphant smile of absolute victory crept across his wrinkled face as he pulled Cecilia close to his chest. He truly believed he had buried his past. He truly thought he had successfully thrown out the trash. But as Elnora drove toward the rugged, unforgiving hills of Kentucky, gripping the worn steering wheel with her calloused hands, she did not know that the $15 piece of trash resting in her coat pocket was not a lonely tombstone for her old age. It was a detailed treasure map that would lead straight to her former husband's ultimate humiliating destruction.
The first night was completely unforgiving. Elnora curled her 72-year-old body into the cramped back seat of her 1998 station wagon. The worn fabric smelled of stale dust and old engine oil. Outside the frosted windows, the temperature steadily plummeted to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold seeped through the thin metal doors, biting into her aging joints with a dull, relentless ache. She pulled her heavy wool coat tighter around her shoulders, refusing to shiver. Under the flickering yellow glow of a solitary gas station street lamp, she opened her battered leather purse. She emptied the meager contents onto her lap. She counted the crumpled paper bills and heavy silver coins, her stiff fingers moving with slow, mechanical precision. 10, 20, 40, 50. $58.25. That was the sum total of her entire existence. Half a century of back-breaking labor, of scrubbing floors, baking pies, and building an empire of millions had been brutally reduced to a handful of dirty pocket change. Arthur and his young mistress were sleeping in silk sheets, surrounded by $4.5 million of stolen luxury. Elnora
was sleeping in a freezing parking lot, alone. She did not shed a single tear. When the pale morning light finally broke across the horizon, she climbed into the driver's seat. Her back screamed in protest, but her face remained entirely impassive. She drove the last 70 miles deep into the rugged, isolated heart of Blackwood County, Kentucky. The smooth, paved highways gradually gave way to cracked asphalt, and then to rough, pitted dirt roads lined with dense, imposing oak forests. She parked the rattling car at the edge of a narrow gravel shoulder and stepped out into the damp, biting chill of the mountain air. Before her lay the grim, undeniable reality of the $15 deed. This was her 2-acre estate. Whispering Creek Mill was a towering monument to absolute decay. The heavy timber roof had caved in decades ago, leaving jagged, splintered oak beams pointing toward the gray sky like the broken ribs of a massive dead beast. A thick, suffocating blanket of creeping green moss covered the remaining stone foundation. The massive wooden water wheel, measuring an imposing 20 feet in diameter, was jammed deeply into a thick, unyielding bed of black, foul-smelling mud. The overwhelming stench of rotting wood, stagnant water, and decaying autumn leaves filled the cold air. It was a graveyard of forgotten industry. A rusted pickup truck slowly rumbled down the gravel road behind her, its heavy tires crunching loudly. 2 young local men in grease-stained canvas overalls leaned heavily out of the open windows. They chewed dark tobacco and stared shamelessly at the elderly woman standing alone before the ruined structure. They knew exactly who she was. Gossip traveled faster than the wind in Blackwood County. "Hey there, Grandma," the driver hollered, his loud voice laced with cruel, unfiltered amusement. "Hear the rich lady got kicked out onto the street. Guess you came all the way down here to live with the river rats, huh? You better watch your step or the creek will wash your old bones away." The passenger laughed harshly, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the dirt. A small group of older women walking toward the general store a quarter-mile down the road stopped to whisper behind their hands. They shook their heads in mock pity, clearly enjoying the spectacular downfall of a wealthy outsider. Elnora did not flinch. She did not turn her head to acknowledge their petty, mocking words. She did not scream at them to leave her alone, nor did she display even a fraction of the deep humiliation they eagerly expected to see. She calmly bent down and picked up a heavy, fallen oak branch. She gripped the rough bark tightly, testing its solid weight in her calloused hands, and used it as a sturdy walking stick. She stepped off the gravel and began the slow, treacherous descent down the steep, muddy bank toward the ruined mill. Each determined step sunk 2 inches into the soft, unforgiving earth. She ignored the freezing dampness seeping steadily through her worn leather boots. She ignored the harsh whispers of the locals fading behind her. She reached the bottom of the bank and stood beneath the towering shadow of the rotting water wheel. The icy creek rushed loudly past her boots. She placed her bare, calloused hand against the slick black mud caked heavily around the thick iron base of the wheel. She closed her eyes. Everyone in town firmly believed this rotting trap was the lonely, pathetic graveyard of a discarded old woman. But as her rough fingers scraped away a thick layer of freezing mud beneath the heavy wooden paddles, a very strange, hollow metallic sound suddenly echoed through the silent ruins. The morning mist clung tightly to the ruined valley. Elnora stepped carefully over a mound of collapsed roofing, her heavy leather boots sinking slightly into the rotting pine planks. She did not see an insurmountable disaster. Having been raised on a brutal, unforgiving dirt farm in her youth, she possessed a rare, practiced eye that stripped away surface decay to reveal the structural truth hidden beneath. She possessed the quiet vision of a survivor.
She kicked away jagged shards of broken glass, thick layers of slimy brown river moss, tangled nests of dead copperhead snakes, and heavy piles of crumbling, waterlogged drywall. She stood in the center of the main grinding floor. The omniscient silence of the valley held a deep, forgotten history. Whispering Creek Mill had been erected in 1860, built by men who understood that true strength came from the earth itself. It had ground thousands of pounds of golden wheat and white corn for weary soldiers, standing tall and defiant through the bloody devastation of the American Civil War. It had survived brutal winters, catastrophic spring floods, and decades of total human neglect. It was a massive fortress. Arthur and his army of overpaid corporate lawyers had looked at the $15 tax assessment and seen nothing but a miserable pile of worthless, rotting garbage. They had seen a fitting, humiliating tomb for an old, discarded woman. They were completely wrong. Elnora knelt in the damp filth. She used her bare, calloused hands to scrape away 6 inches of foul, black sludge from the floorboards. Her fingernails packed with dark dirt, her knuckles scraping painfully against hidden stones. She did not stop. She kept digging. She kept searching. Solid wood finally appeared. It was not the cheap, flimsy plywood of modern mansions, nor was it the fragile, decorative pine that lined Arthur's pristine $4.5 million study. It was old-growth American white oak. The massive hand-hewn floorboards were 3 inches thick and 12 inches wide. Because they had been submerged in the cold, oxygen-deprived mud of the creek bed for over 70 years, the timber had not rotted or splintered into dust. The dense, iron-like wood had essentially petrified. It was completely impervious to termites, perfectly preserved by the very water that everyone assumed had completely destroyed it. Elnora dragged her rough palm across the exposed grain. "You are still breathing," she whispered softly, her voice carrying a profound, reverent respect for the ancient timber. She stood up and walked toward the massive collapsed water wheel. The giant wooden paddles had dissolved into soft mush long ago, but as she waded knee-deep into the freezing, rushing creek, her hands traced the central axis. Beneath a thick crust of brittle orange rust and tangled green algae, she felt the smooth, cold certainty of solid metal. It was a single, continuous shaft of forged wrought iron, 10 feet long and weighing at least 500 pounds. It was perfectly straight. It had not bowed, cracked, or yielded a single inch under the crushing weight of a century. The bones were perfect. Elnora looked down at the foundation. The entire towering structure was anchored relentlessly to the earth by enormous blocks of rough-cut gray granite. Each massive stone was completely untouched by time, locked together in a flawless, immovable grid that no modern bulldozer could easily tear apart. She walked carefully along the perimeter of the foundation. The outer walls stretched exactly 40 feet long and 30 feet wide. The main support columns were entire tree trunks, massive white oak pillars measuring 24 inches in diameter, stripped of their bark and cured by decades of wind and rain. In the sterile, temperature-controlled heights of the city, Arthur believed that value was strictly defined by glowing numbers on a bank screen and expensive imported Italian marble. He believed that anything old, broken, or quiet was entirely useless. He had applied that exact ruthless philosophy to his marriage. He had discarded his wife of 50 years the moment her face showed the inevitable, dignified map of aging. He had made a fatal miscalculation. She spent the next 8 hours meticulously cataloging the sprawling ruins. She pulled rusted iron nails from shattered window frames, tore down hanging vines of poisonous ivy, dragged heavy waterlogged mattresses dumped by careless teenagers out into the sunlight, and carefully sorted the usable timber from the hopeless debris.
She measured the steep angle of the roofline, tested the heavy iron hinges of the surviving oak doors, and cleared away 30 pounds of jagged river rock, blocking the main drainage channel. Her silver hair, tied back in a severe practical bun, became coated in a fine layer of gray dust and dry soot. The chill of the afternoon air dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, yet her sweat beaded on her forehead. She worked in absolute silence. She did not pause to complain about the freezing wind whipping through the open walls. She did not stop to massage her fiercely aching shoulders. Her back throbbed with a dull, sickening pain, and her empty stomach cramped continuously, but her mind was fiercely alive. While Cecilia painted her delicate nails and Arthur counted his stolen millions, Elnora was carefully resurrecting a sleeping giant. She was finally home. The $15 deed was not a joke. It was a priceless, historical masterpiece hiding beneath a temporary mask of dirt. The structural skeleton of the magnificent mill had been completely verified, and its deep foundation was completely unbreakable. She had found the indestructible white oak, the heavy wrought iron, and the solid granite walls, but she had not yet seen what lay quietly sleeping beneath the massive 3,000-pound stone slab at the bottom of the grinding pit.
The first 3 weeks were a masterclass in silent, brutal endurance. Every single morning at exactly 5 a.m., Elnora woke up in the freezing back seat of her 1998 station wagon. She drank a solitary cup of cold, bitter black coffee, walked down the steep gravel embankment, and began to bleed for her survival. She did not have the luxury of heavy diesel machinery. She did not have a massive team of expensive, specialized contractors. She certainly did not have the millions of dollars her ex-husband was currently wasting on imported champagne and meaningless luxury. She had only her own 2 hands. The physical work was absolutely merciless. She spent the first 7 agonizing days entirely waist-deep in the freezing, rushing creek, fighting violently against the heavy water current as she cleared 60 years of accumulated debris from the massive iron water wheel. She hauled out tangled, suffocating ropes of slimy river moss, dragged heavy branches of rotting pine, pried loose jagged shards of rusted metal roofing, and scooped out hundreds of pounds of dense, heavy black mud with a battered tin bucket. Her knuckles bled. Her brittle fingernails cracked. Her lower back throbbed with a sickening, relentless pain that radiated completely down to her frozen toes. Miles away, in the temperature-controlled sanctuary of the $4.5 million estate, Arthur was likely complaining to his private tailor about the slight, unacceptable stiffness of a custom silk lapel. Cecilia, his young mistress, was likely crying in frustration over a chipped, perfectly painted fingernail. They were surrounded by millions of stolen dollars, yet they possessed absolutely no actual substance. Elnora did not shed a single tear. When her rough hands blistered and cracked open, she wrapped them tightly in torn strips of her old cotton dresses and kept pulling the heavy stones from the creek bed. She swung a heavy steel sledgehammer, driving long iron spikes deep into the shifting earth to firmly stabilize the eroding bank. She lifted massive planks of waterlogged oak, using nothing but raw leverage, crude wooden fulcrums, and the desperate, burning strength of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. She survived entirely on cheap, stale bread and cold canned beans. For 14 consecutive days, Silas Thorne watched her closely from the high wooded ridge. He was exactly 68 years old. He was a retired local carpenter, a quiet widower who lived alone in a small cabin a half-mile up the dirt road, and a man who deeply understood the silent, profound language of honest, backbreaking labor. At first, he had completely expected the wealthy, displaced city woman to give up. He expected her to scream in frustration, to break down sobbing in the foul mud, to call an expensive tow truck and flee back to the comfortable paved roads of modern civilization by the second afternoon. She never broke. Silas stood silently on his worn wooden front porch, nursing a steaming mug of hot tea. He
He watched this 72-year-old woman drag 50-pound logs across the uneven, treacherous ground without uttering a single complaint. He saw the undeniable dignity in her straight posture. He clearly recognized the profound, unbreakable resilience radiating from her bruised, exhausted body. He understood her completely. On the morning of the 15th day, the temperature dropped rapidly to a bitter 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Elnora was struggling desperately to move a massive, collapsed ceiling beam that heavily pinned the main iron grinding gear to the freezing dirt. The thick, waterlogged oak beam weighed at least 300 pounds. She pushed, she pulled, she wedged a thick wooden lever underneath it, leaning her entire body weight against the rough fulcrum, but the massive timber refused to budge a single inch. She was entirely stuck. She paused, her chest heaving violently, wiping a messy mixture of cold sweat and black mud from her wrinkled forehead. A tall shadow suddenly fell across the dirt. "You need a block and tackle system for that kind of dead weight," Silas said quietly. Elnora turned around slowly. Silas stood calmly at the edge of the ruined foundation, wearing faded denim overalls and a heavy, insulated flannel jacket. He carried a heavy canvas bag of steel tools over his broad shoulder and held a thick coil of heavy hemp rope in his rough, calloused hands. He did not offer any pitying smiles, he did not ask if she was okay, and he did not make meaningless small talk about the freezing weather. "I cannot pay you," Elnora stated firmly. Her voice was completely steady, offering absolutely no apologies for her current desperate poverty. Silas simply nodded, walked right past her without asking for permission, and began looping the heavy rope over a sturdy, surviving upper support beam. "I did not ask for money," Silas replied smoothly. He securely fastened the heavy iron pulley, tossed the thick end of the rope down to the mud, and looked her directly in the eye. "I just hate seeing a perfectly good piece of historical timber rot in the dirt, and I hate seeing a stubborn woman break her back for absolutely no good reason." Elnora looked at him for a long, silent moment. She saw the dark engine grease on his hands and the quiet, genuine respect in his gray eyes. She slowly picked up her end of the heavy rope. They pulled together. The massive oak beam groaned loudly, shifted, and finally lifted heavily into the cold air, completely freeing the rusted iron gear beneath it. From that morning on, the two elderly people worked in a profound, comfortable silence. They communicated entirely through the shared, rhythmic language of heavy labor. Silas brought his heavy gasoline chainsaws, his powerful hydraulic jacks, and his extensive lifelong knowledge of 19th century timber framing. He taught Elnora exactly how to properly mix traditional lime mortar, how to sister fresh oak beams alongside the ancient petrified framing, and how to perfectly balance the heavy structural loads across the massive granite foundation. Elnora learned incredibly fast. She measured the tight angles perfectly. She hammered the heavy iron nails with practiced, brutal precision. She worked endlessly from dawn till dusk, her physical body growing leaner, harder, and immensely stronger with every passing week. Silas brought her a hot thermos of hearty vegetable stew every single afternoon. They would sit together on the cold, damp foundation stones, eating quietly in the fading afternoon light, watching the rushing creek water slowly clear of dark debris. They were forging something magnificent. By the end of the second long month, the heavy structural skeleton of the mill had been completely and safely stabilized. The tall walls no longer sagged dangerously to the left. The heavy, collapsed roof had been safely dismantled and entirely cleared away. The giant 20-foot water wheel had been painstakingly dug out of the suffocating black mud, heavily reinforced with thick steel brackets, and scrubbed completely clean of its rotting green moss. However, the giant wheel could not turn.
The deep grinding pit directly beneath it was still completely choked with centuries of compacted earth, thick roots, and heavy river rock. "We have to dig down deep into the gear pit to clear the lower water channel," Silas explained carefully, pointing a thick, calloused finger into the dark, flooded hole beneath the main grinding floor.
The rushing water needs a clear, unobstructed path to spin the lower paddles, or the entire mechanism will just jam up again. Elnora nodded slowly, picking up a heavy steel pickaxe. "Then we dig," she answered simply. For 3 exhausting days, they climbed down into the claustrophobic, 5-foot-deep stone pit. They were completely covered in wet, freezing mud. They used heavy steel shovels and thick plastic buckets to haul out exactly 50 cubic yards of packed dirt, tangled tree roots, rotting animal bones, and heavy, jagged river rocks. The dead air inside the pit was thick, foul, and incredibly suffocating. The temperature hovered around 45 degrees Fahrenheit in the damp hole, chilling them both entirely to the bone. Arthur would have vomited violently at the mere smell. Elnora simply tightened her firm grip on the wooden handle and swung the heavy steel pickaxe again. She swung with the dark, heavy memory of the 50 years she had lost. She swung with the quiet, burning dignity of a woman refusing to be permanently erased. She swung the heavy steel down into the hardened dirt with a steady, rhythmic power that completely defied her 72 years of age. Silas shoveled the loose, wet debris into a heavy metal wheelbarrow, his breathing ragged but completely steady. They were moving closer to the very bottom, slowly reaching the original stone floor that had not seen the light of day since the 1860s. The heavy mud grew thicker, colder, and significantly darker. They finally reached the last layer of densely compacted clay. "Just a few more inches, Elnora," Silas said heavily, wiping his brow. "I can feel the bottom granite slab." Elnora raised the heavy steel pickaxe high over her tired shoulder, aiming precisely for a thick, stubborn oak root buried deeply in the dark corner of the pit. She brought the heavy tool down with all her remaining physical strength, fully expecting the soft, familiar thud of wet dirt and rotting wood. She did not hit dirt. The sharp sound echoed loudly. It was not the dull, hollow thud of heavy steel striking wet clay, nor was it the harsh, grinding scrape of metal violently glancing off a solid granite boulder, but rather a distinct, resonant chime of forged iron striking hollow iron. The sudden vibration shot violently up the wooden handle of the pickaxe, rattling Elnora's tired bones. She completely froze. Silas stopped shoveling immediately. He dropped his heavy steel shovel into the thick mud and waded carefully through the freezing water to stand directly beside her. The dark, cramped space beneath the massive water wheel suddenly felt incredibly quiet. The temperature in the deep pit remained a bitter 40 degrees Fahrenheit, yet neither of them felt the biting cold. "That was not a rock," Silas murmured slowly. Elnora dropped to her bruised knees in the freezing, ankle-deep water. She tossed the heavy pickaxe aside and plunged her bare, calloused hands directly into the foul, freezing sludge. She dug frantically like a desperate survivor, her stiff fingers scraping violently against sharp stones, tearing through thick, rotting pine roots, and scooping away heavy handfuls of black mud. She felt a flat surface. It was exactly 3 feet beneath the main mud line, tightly wedged into a narrow, deliberate gap between 2 massive, immobile granite foundation blocks. Elnora cleared away another thick layer of debris, revealing the top of a heavy, rectangular object. It was a solid iron trunk. The heavy box measured exactly 24 inches long, 18 inches wide, and 12 inches deep. It was entirely encased in a thick, hardened layer of black pitch, a primitive but highly effective waterproofing method used extensively during the 19th century. The thick, tar-like substance had perfectly protected the metal from the relentless, corrosive moisture of the rushing creek for over a century. The omniscient valley held a dark, silent history. Back in the brutal, bloody autumn of 1862, the American Civil War had violently torn the nation completely apart.
Sweeping raiding parties from both the Union and Confederate armies relentlessly pillaged the rural countryside, burning prosperous farms to ash, slaughtering livestock, and violently stealing everything of tangible value. The original owner of Whispering Creek Mill, a cautious, fiercely independent man, had seen the thick black smoke rising ominously over the distant hills. In the dead of night, he had carefully sealed his entire life savings inside this heavy iron trunk, burying it deep beneath the freezing water wheel where no desperate, starving soldier would ever think to look. He had marched off to defend his valley the very next morning. He never returned. The heavy iron trunk had waited patiently in the freezing dark for exactly 164 years. It waited through brutal blizzards, massive spring floods, and the slow, inevitable collapse of the magnificent timber structure above it. It waited quietly for someone who possessed the exact same relentless, unbreakable spirit as the man who had buried it. It waited for Elnora. "We need the heavy pry bars," Elnora stated calmly. Silas quickly climbed out of the deep pit, returning moments later with 2 thick, forged steel crowbars. They wedged the heavy metal bars down into the tight, muddy crevice beside the iron trunk. They leaned their combined weight against the rough steel handles, straining their aging muscles completely to the absolute limit. The heavy iron box shifted slightly. "Pull!" Silas grunted heavily. The thick, ancient suction of the wet clay finally broke with a loud, wet, tearing sound. The heavy iron trunk slid out of the tight granite crevice. It was incredibly dense, weighing easily over 80 pounds. Together, the 2 exhausted, shivering elders hoisted the heavy, mud-caked box out of the flooded pit and dragged it safely onto the dry, solid white oak planks of the main grinding floor. The afternoon sun broke briefly through the gray clouds. Elnora knelt quietly beside the heavy trunk. She used a rusted iron chisel to scrape away the thick, hardened layers of black pitch, slowly revealing a massive, heavily rusted iron padlock. The thick lock was completely fused together by decades of dampness, entirely impenetrable to any normal key. Elnora did not hesitate. She stood up, walked over to the wooden tool bench, and picked up the heavy 10-pound steel sledgehammer. At this exact moment, 80 miles away in the sprawling, sterile city of Arthur Vance, Arthur was undoubtedly screaming furiously at his terrified wealth managers. He was likely pacing back and forth across his expensive Persian rugs, sweating nervously as his fragile, artificially inflated corporate stocks plummeted violently in the volatile modern market, completely terrified of losing his precious, superficial status. Elnora raised the heavy sledgehammer high above her head. She brought it down violently against the rusted iron padlock. The heavy steel head struck the brittle iron with a deafening, explosive crack. The lock shattered instantly into 3 jagged pieces, scattering loudly across the solid oak floorboards. Elnora dropped the heavy hammer. She knelt back down in the dirt, her heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm, and placed her rough, bleeding hands heavily upon the thick iron lid. She pushed upward. The heavy, rusted iron hinges shrieked loudly in violent protest, protesting their sudden, shocking return to the world of the living. The heavy lid fell backward. Elnora and Silas simply stared down into the trunk. They did not gasp, they did not scream, and they did not jump up and down in a frenzy of wild, uncontrolled emotion. They were completely, utterly silenced by the profound weight of history staring back at them. The iron trunk was packed entirely to the brim. It held dozens of heavy, rectangular gold bars, completely untarnished by the cruel passage of time, gleaming with a heavy, buttery yellow light. Stacked neatly beside the heavy bullion, hundreds of heavy minted gold coins, $20 double eagles from the 1850s, their intricate historical faces completely untouched by the freezing water. It was a fortune of unimaginable magnitude. While Arthur had deliberately left her to rot with exactly $58 and a worthless piece of paper, the universe had quietly guided her calloused hands directly towards a massive, sleeping empire.
The heavy wooden door of the restored mill remained firmly secured the next morning. Silas had driven exactly 40 miles into the nearest city at the crack of dawn to make a highly secure, private telephone call from a quiet public booth. He contacted a premier historical heritage appraiser located in Louisville. By noon, a discreet, unmarked black sedan pulled slowly up to the muddy gravel shoulder of the dirt road. The appraiser stepped out into the crisp 50 degrees Fahrenheit mountain air. He was a meticulous, quiet man wearing thick spectacles, carrying a heavy leather briefcase filled with specialized magnifying lenses, precise brass scales, and thick historical reference volumes. He walked cautiously down the steep dirt bank, clearly expecting to find a miserable, rotting ruin holding a handful of worthless, tarnished pennies. He stepped inside the massive, stabilized oak structure. Elnora stood completely still beside the heavy wooden workbench. She still wore her faded, mud-stained cotton dress and her scuffed leather work boots. Her hands were heavily bandaged, bleeding slightly from the brutal physical labor of the previous weeks, standing in stark, absolute contrast to the delicate, fragile hands of the wealthy women the appraiser usually served. The heavy iron trunk sat open on the solid oak table. The appraiser adjusted his thick glasses, pulled a jeweler's loop from his breast pocket, and gently picked up a single $20 double eagle. He completely stopped breathing. He meticulously examined the flawless, heavy strike, the complete lack of physical circulation wear, the pristine ridged edges, and the unmistakable buttery luster of pure 19th century bullion that had been perfectly preserved by the thick black pitch and the freezing oxygen-deprived water. He picked up another heavy coin, and then another, his hands shaking violently as he weighed the massive rectangular gold bars on his brass scale. While Arthur Vance was desperately shuffling meaningless digital numbers on glowing screens to maintain his crumbling, artificial empire, Elnora was staring directly at tangible, indestructible history. "This is completely unprecedented," the appraiser whispered softly, wiping a heavy bead of cold sweat from his pale forehead with a folded cotton handkerchief. "These are entirely uncirculated mint states from 1860. Elnora watched him calculate the numbers. "The heavy gold bullion alone is magnificent, but these rare historical coins carry an immense, staggering premium for serious collectors," the appraiser explained, his voice trembling heavily with deep, unconcealed reverence. "The total market value for the contents of this iron trunk is exactly $3,200,000, perhaps even more at a private auction." $3,200,000. Elnora did not faint. She did not scream in wild, uncontrolled triumph, nor did she collapse against the heavy oak table in weeping, hysterical relief. She simply closed her eyes for a brief, fleeting moment, quietly absorbing the profound, heavy justice of the universe. She had been brutally tossed aside with $58 and a $15 deed, and she had resurrected an absolute empire with her bare, bleeding hands. "That is not all, Mrs. Vance," the appraiser continued, gesturing broadly toward the massive 24-inch thick white oak columns and the perfectly aligned, heavy granite blocks of the foundation. "I appraise historical architecture as well. Because you and Mr. Thorne have so perfectly preserved the original structural framing and the iron water wheel, this entire property easily qualifies as a National Heritage Site." He placed the heavy gold coin gently back into the dark trunk.
With the natural spring water restored and the structural integrity secured, this estate is worth millions of dollars more, he concluded firmly. You are sitting on an absolute masterpiece. Elnora looked calmly at Silas. The retired carpenter offered a slow, deeply respectful nod. They had fought the heavy mud, the freezing cold, and the bitter physical exhaustion, and they had won absolutely everything. They were incredibly wealthy.
Exactly 300 miles away, Arthur Vance was drowning in his own catastrophic arrogance. He was exactly 75 years old. The massive artificial empire he had built on ruthless greed and deliberate cruelty had entirely collapsed in less than 3 short months. Cecilia, the heavily painted 35-year-old mistress he had destroyed his 50-year marriage for, had proven to be infinitely more cunning than he ever anticipated. She had quietly manipulated his private trust accounts, completely drained the massive liquid offshore assets, forged his desperate signature on the final corporate transfer documents, and vanished without a trace on a direct flight to a tropical island completely lacking an extradition treaty. She took everything. The bank immediately foreclosed on the $4.5 million estate. The luxury cars were quickly repossessed by silent men in dark suits. The prestigious board of directors brutally forced him out of his own company, erasing his proud name from the towering glass building forever. He was entirely bankrupt. He was sitting alone in a cheap, foul-smelling rented motel room, drinking cheap liquor from a plastic cup, when the local television news broadcast the unbelievable story. The bright screen flashed vivid, sweeping images of Whispering Creek Mill. It was no longer a miserable $15 pile of worthless, rotting trash. It was a magnificent, fully stabilized historical estate, holding a staggering $3,200,000 in pristine 19th-century gold. The news anchor smiled brightly, detailing how an inspiring 72-year-old discarded wife had found the massive treasure buried entirely in the mud. Arthur shattered his plastic cup against the thin drywall. He drove his heavily mortgaged remaining vehicle wildly down the paved highways, his dark mind burning intensely with desperate, greedy entitlement. He fully intended to intimidate his discarded wife. He fully intended to scream, to threaten, and legally steal half of the massive fortune she had dug out of the dirt with her bare hands. The sleek silver car tore recklessly down the narrow dirt roads of Blackwood County, leaving a massive, choking cloud of thick brown dust in its frantic wake. Arthur slammed on the brakes violently, sliding several yards before stopping just inches from the newly reinforced oak perimeter fence. He stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight. The mountain temperature was a mild 65 degrees Fahrenheit, yet Arthur was sweating profusely inside his wrinkled, heavily soiled designer suit. He completely expected to find Elnora broken, weeping, and easily manipulated. He was entirely wrong. He walked arrogantly toward the massive water wheel, his leather shoes sinking deeply into the gravel. Elnora stood quietly on the heavy oak porch. She wore a clean, beautifully pressed linen dress, her silver hair perfectly braided and pinned away from her weathered, deeply dignified face. Silas stood silently to her right, holding a heavy steel wrench. Beside Silas stood the local county sheriff, a massive, imposing man wearing a crisp brown uniform, heavy leather boots, and a shining silver badge. Arthur ignored the two men, fixing his desperate, bloodshot eyes entirely upon his ex-wife. "Elnora, my darling!" Arthur called out loudly, his thin voice dripping with a nauseating, entirely fabricated affection. "I heard the magnificent news. I always knew sending you down here was a brilliant strategic investment for our shared future." Elnora did not blink.
She looked down at him from the elevated wooden porch, her straight posture radiating an absolute, unshakable authority that made the tall man suddenly look incredibly small. "You do not have a future here," she stated quietly. Arthur dropped the fake, pathetic smile immediately, his wrinkled face twisting violently into an ugly, cruel sneer of desperate rage. "Do not play games with me, you old fool," he snarled viciously, stepping heavily onto the bottom wooden stair. "That gold was found by you while we are still technically finalizing the long-term tax structures of our previous estates. That is a marital asset. I am legally entitled to exactly 50% of that $3,200,000, or my expensive lawyers will drag you through the Supreme Court until you are entirely dead." Elnora reached calmly into the deep front pocket of her dress. She pulled out a heavy, formally folded piece of thick parchment paper. It was not a new legal document. It was the exact ruthless divorce decree that Arthur and his army of aggressive corporate lawyers had specifically drafted to permanently strip her of her massive 50-year investment. She slowly, deliberately unfolded the heavy paper, holding it up to the afternoon sunlight. "Read paragraph 4, section B," Elnora commanded softly, handing the paper directly to the towering sheriff. The tall officer cleared his throat, reading the heavy legal text with a booming, authoritative voice that echoed clearly across the quiet valley. "Party B, being Elnora Vance, accepts full legal ownership of Whispering Creek Mill," the sheriff read, slowly, perfectly enunciating every single word. "Party A, being Arthur Vance, completely surrenders all future rights, claims, or entitlements to any tangible or intangible assets discovered, developed, or generated on said property in perpetuity, forever." Arthur stopped breathing entirely. He stared blankly at the crisp piece of paper in absolute paralyzed horror. In his arrogant, hurried desperation to quickly discard his aging wife and permanently evade paying property taxes on a worthless $15 ruin, he had forced her to sign an ironclad agreement severing him from the land entirely. He had legally, permanently locked himself completely out of his own salvation. That was only meant for the dirt," Arthur stammered wildly, his face turning a sickening shade of pale gray. "The wood is not rotting anymore," Elnora replied calmly. She looked steadily at his shaking hands, his panicked eyes, and the deep, inescapable misery written completely across his aging face. She felt absolutely zero pity for the man standing below her. He had brutally thrown away a 50-year marriage for temporary vanity, and the universe had perfectly balanced the scales with terrifying, absolute precision. "You valued my entire life at exactly $58.25. You threw me away for a woman who has already destroyed you. You are exactly where you belong, Arthur. You are completely bankrupt." The sheriff stepped forward heavily, resting his large hand deliberately upon his thick leather gun belt. "You are trespassing on private property, sir," the sheriff warned firmly, his dark eyes narrowing at the pathetic, trembling man. "Get back in your car, turn around, and never come back to Blackwood County." Several local townsfolk had slowly gathered near the main dirt road to watch the loud commotion. The exact same people who had mocked Elnora weeks ago now pointed openly at the arrogant city man in the ruined suit, whispering loudly and laughing at his total spectacular humiliation. Arthur backed away slowly, his shoulders completely slumped in complete devastating defeat. He had absolutely nothing left. He climbed silently back into his silver car, his hands trembling violently on the leather steering wheel. He turned the key, put the heavy vehicle in reverse, and slowly backed up the steep gravel embankment, completely broken by his own monumental greed. Elnora stood perfectly still beside Silas, her head held high, watching the heavy trail of dust rise into the crisp afternoon air as the car disappeared forever over the hill.
Exactly 1 year passed. The magnificent Whispering Creek Mill stood completely, beautifully reborn. The massive 20-foot wooden water wheel slowly turned in the rushing water. The heavy creek crashed rhythmically over the thick wooden paddles, creating a brilliant, misty spray of pure white foam that perfectly caught the warm, golden light of the early morning sun. The deep grinding pit was completely clear of all black mud. The thick white oak beams were perfectly oiled and heavily reinforced, proudly bearing the tremendous weight of a brand new, solid pine roof. The expansive 2-acre property was completely transformed into a breathtaking ecotourism resort, a pristine nature retreat, and a heavily protected historical museum that drew eager visitors from hundreds of miles away. Elnora Vance had not kept the staggering $3,200,000 entirely for herself. She shared the massive blessing. She established a magnificent, heavily funded educational trust to honor the profound, forgotten history of the Quiet Valley. The Whispering Creek Foundation actively provided generous, full-ride college scholarships, heavy backpacks filled with expensive textbooks, and sturdy winter clothing to dozens of poor, hard-working local children living deep in the isolated, forgotten hills of Blackwood County. She completely rebuilt the local community by quietly investing in their limitless future. She gave them incredible hope. The crisp morning air hovered at a perfect 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Elnora sat peacefully on the sprawling, elevated front porch that she had personally nailed together with her own bleeding hands exactly 12 months prior. She wore a beautifully tailored, breathable white linen dress that perfectly complemented her striking silver hair. Her rough, calloused hands that had violently torn away heavy mud, rusted iron, and 50 years of absolute betrayal, now gently held a delicate porcelain teacup. Silas Thorne sat comfortably beside her. He rested in a heavy wooden rocking chair. He slowly sipped his dark coffee, his worn, weathered face completely relaxed in the profound, unbreakable peace of the Quiet Valley. They did not need to speak constantly to validate their deep mutual respect. They simply sat in absolute, dignified silence, watching the rushing water together. People always measure their personal value by exactly how much they have lost in this cruel world, Elnora whispered softly, her steady voice carrying perfectly over the rhythmic, heavy splashing of the turning water wheel. They mourn the grand, expensive houses, the massive bank accounts, the stolen money, and the fleeting, artificial youth. That is a profound, irreversible tragedy. True human value is completely determined by exactly what you can painstakingly build from a miserable, discarded pile of cold, gray ashes. She continued calmly, looking out over the magnificent, sprawling estate. As long as the deep, underground river of genuine human kindness and quiet, unbreakable resilience never entirely dries up, the heavy wheel of life will always find a way to turn again. The bright golden sun rose completely over the rugged, ancient mountains. It cast long, warm, beautiful shadows across the immaculate, sweeping green lawns, the blooming wild dogwood trees, and the solid, indestructible granite foundation of the restored mill. The heavy water flowed endlessly downstream, permanently washing away every single trace of the bitter past. Elnora closed her eyes, entirely at peace with the magnificent world she had single-handedly resurrected. The massive wooden wheel kept turning.